Many people are struggling to meet their financial obligations due to the struggling economy. This has been exacerbated, of course, by COVID-19 as well as the subsequent lockdown. So according to Tenant Profile Network Credit Bureau, many parents have failed to pay their children's school fees as they prioritize other debts. So for more on this, we're joined now by Michelle Dickens. Michelle, a very good morning to you. Thank you so much for your time. But this certainly has been a very difficult 2 years for South Africans struggling to make any form of ends meet, just given what the COVID-19 pandemic with the subsequent regulations imposed, subsequent job losses that have been incurred has actually caused and spurred up. Just how dire is the situation so far?
So we look at data across all the different types of credit payment behavior, and we can see that in general, South African consumers spend 68% of their salary just on the living costs. So our housing costs, our transport costs, health costs, and putting food on the table. And a lot of that is spurred on by credit expenditure as well, in terms of our bonds, our mortgages, our credit card expense, etc. And coming into the first quarter, term starts in next week, parents are now having to pay school fees. On top of school fees, we've got extraordinary expenses like uniform expenses, stationery costs, textbooks costs, etc. And so we see that school fees are really one of the last priority payments that parents make, right down below. As I said, our bond repayments, our rent, our car repayments, credit card repayments, etc. And we see that coming into the last quarter of every year, cyclical, this is when school fees are best paid, best performance, and normally that sits at around about 69 to 70%. So prior to the pandemic, we had 30% of school fees still in a non-payment status. Now, in the hard lockdown quarter, only 1 in 2 parents were able to pay. And towards the end of last year, we see that we're still only sitting at 60%. So parents still really, really struggling just to catch up last year's payments still.
Yeah. And you can imagine that the school will be putting pressure on the parents to make subsequent payment. And I think more than anything else, it's also the children that may be feeling the subsequent pressure coming in from the very same parents themselves. So at this moment in time, is there a solution for parents? Is it a solution of moving to perhaps less expensive schools? Is it even a case of discussion at this point around how is it that you can make ends meet and yet still take care of the children's school fees?
I think the first primary point that we need to consider is that the best interests of the child always need to be taken into consideration. So schools are prohibited from preventing children from access to their report cards. Last quarter, the end of last year, children cannot be prejudiced because the school fees are unpaid. So report cards still need to be issued. Children can't be prohibited from having full access to the academic year, to textbooks that they require, to sporting or cultural activities that they may require. So in a public school environment, parents can approach the school for an exemption, and this is related to a loss of income. So if a parent or both parents have had a loss of income, then the school will consider their exemption, and if they qualify, the parent is no longer required to pay school fees for the period that they are not earning a salary, where they don't have an income. In terms of private schools, many private schools have issued repayment terms, restructure terms, in order that the children don't lose access to the education that they are currently enrolled at. Unfortunately for private school enrolled children or learners, schools are entitled to cancel contracts in the event of non-payment. And so many children might be faced with a change of schools as we go into the opening of schools again this year, next week.
Yeah, but one must wonder also, Michelle, that how many private schools can actually survive with the number of parents that are not able to make payment. In other words, if about 50 parents are not able to make payment out of, let's say, 60 parents that take the kids to one school, then would those private schools then not be in some way coerced or forced or even, persuaded to lower down their school fees? I mean, I was taking a look a little bit earlier about how much school fees are costing. Private school fees, in fact, are costing, and it's an arm and a leg. And if many parents can't pay those private school fees, should it not then put pressure on the private schools to say, hey, maybe we should consider the state of affairs, especially when it comes to the economy and the impact that it's having on parents?
So we did reach out to our schools, and we looked at not only the income component, in other words, how many parents were struggling to pay school fees, but we looked at the expense component. 2/3 of schools, both private and public schools, indicated that they had to cut back on costs. The cutting back on costs is where the difference was between public and private schools. So our public schools said that they cut back on CapEx and OPEX costs, whereas private schools indicated that they cut back on payroll. And when they cut back on payroll, it was predominantly permanent teachers. So there has been an impact in terms of the budgets of schools, but the impact is based on the cutbacks rather than not decreasing school fees. I know in 2021, school fees, predominantly many schools kept the school fees the same. So rather than decreasing school fees, schools are cutting back on expenses.
Yeah. Michelle, very quickly, as we've run out of time, what's the solution here?
The solution here is jobs. It's employment. It's getting the economy back to where it was. We've lost 2.1 million jobs since the beginning of the pandemic. And we were already at a position where we had high unemployment. So we're sitting at 34.9% unemployment at the moment. We really need to get this economy kick-started back on track and jobs back in the marketplace.
Michelle Dickens, thank you very much for your time this morning. A pleasure. It's an absolutely frightening statistic to know that many of the parents are just struggling to pay off their debt, and yet alone school fees. And of course, with the schools starting next week, many parents would be empathized with around just the expenses that are involved in being able to take your little one to school, especially those that are starting grade 1s as well as grade 8. It's a crazy time indeed.